Dr Vaira Vīķe-Freiberga had a very successful academic career at the University of Montreal's psychology department. Over 3 decades there, she had published many books and articles and was elected Professor Emerita. While many would have felt that was quite enough for one lifetime, Dr Vīķe-Freiberga did not stop there. She returned to her native Latvia, where she served as the country's first female president from 1999 to the year 2007. She then became a candidate for the Secretary General of the United Nations and is now the head of both the Global Leadership Forum and the chairwoman of the Club of Madrid. Dialogue is delighted to have the opportunity to speak with Dr Vīķe-Freiberga on Chinese-Latvian relations, the Baltic countries' role in Europe, and its relationship with Russia after the breakup of the Soviet Union. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Ray. Your Excellency, welcome to our dialogue.
Thank you.
We have followed your career development very closely. You are a very successful academic, but what is it that has prompted you to get involved with the politics?
It was my opportunity to return to my native land after it had been become independent again. My parents went into exile 3 days before the Red Army took Riga, and we wandered over 3 continents over the years. I spent most of my life in Canada, but among the Latvian exiles the feeling was that our country had been illegally annexed to the Soviet Union, and that someday it would regain its independence, since except 1 or 2 countries, the annexation had not been recognized internationally.
Why is it a common practice for women to participate in politics in Europe, particularly in Scandinavian countries?
Well, frankly, women make up half the population of the world, and if you don't make recourse to their abilities and talents, you're wasting half the potential of humanity. Seems a terrible waste.
Why in Asia we fail to have as much women politicians as in Europe? Is that because of democracy itself?
It could be. Generally, for many centuries in most countries there was a patriarchal system that considered that women are only good for producing babies, for breeding, and looking after children, bringing them up, looking after household tasks and things like that, or overseeing them if they were rich. But it was considered that it was not proper.
South Asia is an exception. If you look at Indira Gandhi and
that's true. In fact, they had the first women. They had the first women.
Very brilliant women politicians in South Asia. In Japan, South Korea, they have all much higher percentage of women representation in parliament and in politics. Having said this, you were a contender for the UN General Secretary post in 2006 when Ban Ki-moon from South Korea, who's also attending this forum here in Guangdong, was awarded the position. Have you considered running for the position once again?
No.
No.
The reason Eastern Europe put up my candidacy was to remind the United Nations that they had made a deal 10 years ago, and in the meantime a lot of countries had recovered their independence, and that making deals 10 years in advance, not knowing what happens in the world, is not a fair deal. So the idea was to present an Eastern European candidate, since Eastern Europe as such had never been represented, and it was in many ways a reminder to the United Nations and to the world that we do exist on this planet, and we knew that there was a deal about having an Asian candidate 10 years down the line, but you see, 10 years before that we were not around, so we did not think it was entirely correct to make deals so far in advance.
The essence of BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, aims to be inclusive instead of rejecting the weak and small economies. However, in between our 2 economies, we have this Russia behind this name.
Otherwise, it'd be almost neighbors.
A long history and a lot of stories. But President Putin has his own vision for the Euro-Asian Economic Union, and some of the observers, European and Chinese alike, would say, look, there's going to be head-on collision between the ambitious blueprint of President Putin and the Belt and Road Initiative vision of President Xi Jinping. So do you think that there's a strong possibility for the two initiatives to be integrated and to be put into one basket so that small economies and all other members along the Belt and Road stretch would benefit equally?
I think there's every possibility to do that, and I get the impression that the dialogue between Russia and China is already moving in that direction. The benefits that derive from countries that are far apart communicating will obviously also accrue to the countries in between. And so that if the Belt and Road Initiative reaches out to Europe, and to Eastern Europe, Central Europe, and even Western Europe, in order to get there by the land route, which, by the way, saves 3 weeks over the sea route in terms of transportation of goods, I think that the countries in between, and that means Belarus, Russia, Kazakhstan, they can benefit also from it. And I think that would be, in my understanding, that would be the ideal solution, so that both ends in the middle come out winners, that it's a win-win situation.
26 years after the Cold War came to an end, with the disintegration of the Soviet Union being the hallmark, the most important one, do you think, like some of the overseas observers are concerned, China's initiative for the Belt and Road aims to rebuild the world order, to be a competitor of the United States, and to reconstruct or rebalance the globalization?
I would imagine that that is one of the aims of China. In many ways, China now has an opportunity because of the vacuum left by President Trump's sort of isolationist and protectionist stance about international relations. I don't think that we have seen in a very long time an American president so clearly start at the very beginning of his presidency to say that America will be his focus and the internal politics of America will be his focus, and that in a way he's turning his back on the rest of the world. We do notice now that as his presidency progresses, he is in some sense waking up to the fact that America is not alone in the world, and he has reached out. He has reached out to China, he's reached out to Russia, and he has in some ways changed the very hard stance that he took, for instance, in his inaugural speech. But if the United States, which has been a hegemon economically, in terms of scientific progress, culturally as well, I mean, Hollywood movies, except for Bollywood and the Indians who manufacture their own movies in quantities to the taste of the Indian public, Hollywood has an influence. I think it's the biggest export entertainment from the United States across the world. Well, if they retrench, then there's a vacuum. And from what I can see, China is very much positioned and ready to step into any vacuum that it finds in the world and to come with its own cultural programs and cultural proposals. For instance, I have not seen in Latvia a full-scale movie made in China, whereas we can see American movies all the time.
We have noticed the pullout by President Trump from the Paris Climate Change, TPP, reconsidering NAFTA and your partnership, his partnership with the European allies. And do you think China is ready to come across as a leader to fill in the vacuum, as China has an entirely different set of political institutions and soft power? From a phrase with Joseph Nye of Harvard University, remains a controversial issue for those who follow China's economic expansion, but who are very skeptical about our soft power?
It depends what aspect of soft power you would be looking at. Let's start with the economic collaboration, and I think that this has been going on already for several decades. The balance is shifting. The fact that China recently has done away with some of the tariffs on imports will be welcomed in those countries that have been waiting and have been feeling frustrated about China being ready to export its goods but not so ready to import them. The ties between North America and Europe are historical ones, and they're also ties of political philosophy. I mean, both Canada and the United States started out as European colonies when, during the Civil War in the States, Lafayette and Pulaski and other Europeans went over and helped the Americans. The ideals that the American Constitution enshrines are similar to those of the French Revolution, so that the historical and cultural ties go back a long way. They go very deep, and after all, America is represented in the person of the president, but America is not the president. America is much more. And I think that there are a great many people in America who do not share President Trump's isolationist approach. And I think, as I said, even Mr. Trump seems to me opening up. As he becomes more comfortable in his position as president, I think he's opening up to the world some more. But the fact that China is very much there as a major player in the world, of course, is something that nobody denies, and nobody wishes to enter into conflict with China. We're ready to accept a different form of governance within your country as long as you accept ours. Meanwhile, that is one aspect, I think, that will be a barrier to very close soft power of China, the question of how governance proceeds. You have a top-down hierarchical governance, and the Europeans, at least theoretically, it's not always realized in practice, so according to some people, but theoretically it's bottom-up, so that you know, the ability to vote and to choose between different parties produces an opportunity to feedback, to input on the part of the citizen, and then you build up the pyramid from there. So that we are approaching governance from two different angles or from two different points of view.
Very balanced articulation about what happens in the United States, its domestic politics. You're watching Dialogue with Her Excellency, former President of Latvia and currently Chairwoman of the Club of Madrid, Madam Vīķe-Freiberga, or Dr Vīķe-Freiberga. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us, please. Welcome back. Let's look at what happened 3 years ago, the annexation of Crimea. Well, 10 years ahead of that, you joined the NATO. NATO conducted many military maneuvers, whilst the Russians also did a lot of military drills along the border with Latvia. Can you brief us on the foreign policy of Latvia with Russia in the wake of the Cold War? And do you think NATO stands ready to back up Latvia in whatever circumstances?
I think so. The monument to victory that stands in the center of Riga was built in Soviet times in honor of the Russian victory in the Second World War. After our independence, it was felt that it was a mark of occupation by a foreign power. And some people tried to blow it up. Well, they were actually put in prison for it because we had signed a treaty with Russia. When they withdrew the Red Army troops, 1994, 1995, they asked that all monuments to Russian fallen soldiers, including that huge monument to the Soviet victory, should be maintained by the Latvian government. and so they are to this day. So that question is actually set down in a treaty, and we respect that treaty.
There's no question about the deep-rooted mistrust between Latvian people and the Russians on the eastward expansion of NATO. So can you balance your concerns about history, concerns for the geopolitical equilibrium, and being one of the members of the European Union?
Well, you see, we're members of two bodies. One is the European Union,
and the member of the NATO.
And the other is NATO, and they don't overlap entirely, you see. Like Sweden and Finland are members of the European Union, they are our neighbors, but they are not members of NATO, they're neutral countries. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and all the countries, South and Central Europe, members of NATO. So what we find is that we are actually extremely relieved to have been accepted in the latest, the big enlargement of NATO, because you see, we get regular incursions of Russian planes into our airspace. They arrive with the transponders turned off. They do not give their reference numbers. We have 2 planes with the same reference number in our airspace and things like that. Then the kind of military exercises they have, you see, NATO can't match them. The last Zapad, West kind of military maneuvers were about how, when you have conquered a neighboring small country, how you prevent its allies to come to its aid. That was the legend for the 100,000-man strong military exercise that Russia had just this last fall. So the previous Zapad that they had was, the legend again was how to conquer a small country that is your neighbor. NATO has never had that sort of exercise. It's always defensive.
What does that mean for your future?
I feel that it means more security than poor Latvia had in 1939 when it tried to be a neutral country, and little good it did to us, because first we were occupied by the Soviet Union, and then we were occupied by Nazi Germany, and then by the Soviet Union again, and nobody cared about the fact that we wanted to remain neutral.
One bitter part about the Second World War history is Poland had been sacrificed by the Soviet Union.
And the Baltics.
Right. Baltics were also betrayed. Do you think that's likely to be repeated in the 21st century?
Anything is likely to be repeated if there's motivation for it and opportunity. So this is why one has to prepare against any kind of opportunities and eventualities that one would not like to have. And that's why there are such things as defensive alliances.
I've interviewed some policymakers from Poland. They have been very, very, very careful in addressing the relationship between Warsaw and Moscow. They know they are too close to a controversial neighbor and too far away from God. So they got to be very careful. Do you think you also share the same concern?
I think all of us are at an equal distance from God, but we're not at an equal distance from power and from nuclear weapons and from military might. That is a different story.
Let's come back to examine the differences, if any, between the defense of the European Union and NATO. Do you think European Union would have to do more to rely on its own self-defense instead of turning to the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, particularly after President Trump swear to put America first? That means that the United States would have to lessen its global leadership.
Anybody who relies on somebody else across the ocean for their security is asking for trouble, and Europe got it. In the Second World War and even in the First World War, Mr. Churchill had to beg Roosevelt to start sending him support even before America officially declared war. I think it was to some extent what the Japanese did in Pearl Harbor helped Europe to fight against the Nazis, because they were doing very badly. France had been overrun. Britain was being bombed in the Blitz. The Wehrmacht, the German army, was extremely strong, and they had been preparing for a long time. So things were very tight in Europe, and the presence of Americans made all the difference. And by the way, not just Americans, but also British colonies. So the ties, again, they're historical ties, they're emotional ties, family ties between the two sides of those continents. And as I say, in spite of President Trump's, what I would say, populistic way of addressing the American public and saying, you have been neglected, I will be caring for you, especially you have been left behind, and that is his public, his supporters, who feel that, well, yes, they would like somebody to care for them and to look after them. But the facts of life are such that America cannot really become an island unto itself. And Mr. Trump is beginning to realize the fact that he has had these visits abroad clearly indicates that he's waking up to the fact of the international situation. So that I would imagine the world will remain in a certain equilibrium, but we would hope that the equilibrium between different forces and different political ideologies will remain one that allows for dialogue, that allows for peace and stability, because we know the cost of military conflict.
In your political career, there are two role models in Europe for you to draw inspirations. One is Lady Thatcher, who ordered the invasion of Falklands, who privatized the British economy, who looked at the labor union contemptuously and insisted on a crackdown on their industrial strikes. You also have Angela Merkel. Despite the devastating political setbacks in the latest campaign, she has adopted a very practical foreign policy towards Moscow. Despite the crisis in eastern Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, Angela Merkel, on the one hand, supports economic sanctions against Russia. On the other hand, she keeps visiting Moscow, talking to President Putin. One is pretty tough, Lady Thatcher to the former Soviet Union, or the evil empire. The other, very quiet, practical. The basic point of my question is, which direction would you walk?
We are not about to be threatening Moscow. Our concern clearly is our security and our independence and our sovereignty. In order to obtain a border with Russia, a treaty with Russia, that they would sign, although we had one that was signed in 1920, where Russia at the time, the Russian Federation, renounced in perpetuity all claim to any territory. Latvia gave up one region, it's about 5% of our territory. It's a Pitalova, or Abrene in Latvian, which President Putin claimed was annexed to Latvia in Soviet times, and he wanted to take it back. Or how did it go? When it was a question of Crimea, he admitted the lines drawn by Stalin, and when it was somewhere else to his disadvantage, then he did not admit the lines drawn by Stalin. But Latvia, in order not to have a border dispute with its neighbor, gave up a chunk of territory, and we now have a proper border treaty, and we have, border posts installed and border crossings, everything proper, so that we could be members of NATO and be under the security umbrella that the alliance provides us without having any kind of official disputes with Russia. When the Russian Federation decided to celebrate the 60th anniversary of the end of the Second World War, or the Great Patriotic War, as they called it, President Putin sent invitations to the three presidents of the three Baltic countries, asking them to join other leaders in Moscow to celebrate the 9th of May. The neighboring countries to Latvia, their presidents decided they wouldn't go because they felt that the Second World War was, after all, the occasion of the occupation and annexation of our countries, and therefore they couldn't go. I went because the rest of the European Union went. I was the only one from the Baltic countries who went to Moscow, but we published a book where I explained that for us, with all due respect to the victory of the Allies, of which the Soviet Union was one, over the Nazis, considering the crimes against humanity that the Nazis were committing, it was a good thing, and yes, we could join in the celebrations, also in the celebrations of the end of a bloody war which was killing so many civilians. But when President Putin had a luncheon in the Kremlin for all the heads of delegations, I had some Russian generals who came up to me, and they said that they, with tears in their eyes, they said that they were so grateful that I had come and was able to sort of pay homage to the sacrifices that the Russian military made in the Second World War. And I told them I fully do that. And they embraced me with tears in their eyes, and they said, we're so grateful that you appreciate the sacrifices that we made. And I said, I have only one reproach against the Red Army, is that it didn't go home on the 9th of May, but stayed in Latvia.
Thank you so much. This is a very touching story, and that helps us have a better understanding about the relationship between Latvia, the Baltic states, and Moscow in the wake of the Cold War. I thank you for the very good education. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.